What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today I am back with another video where we have to talk about Paul George, Playoff P, one of the most controversial players in the NBA who's been heavily criticized over the past 3 to 4 years. And today, we're going to break down how great he was in the 2021 playoffs, as well as highlight how bad he was in previous playoff runs after giving himself the nickname of Playoff P. Now before we get into that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, make sure to do so, and if you could like this video, I'd greatly appreciate it. So with that being said, let's get into the video. So the origin of Playoff P comes in the 2018 playoffs before they played the Utah Jazz, and the guy who gave him this nickname was actually Paul George himself. And the first time Playoff P ever suited up, he had 36 points, 7 boards on 65% shooting in a Game 1 victory versus the Utah Jazz. But in games 2, 3, and 4, OKC lose all those games, going down 3-1. So already the Playoff P nickname has a pretty bad origin, as OKC is down 3-1, and Paul George is getting outplayed by rookie Donovan Mitchell. Now in this critical Game 5 in OKC, Paul George would have 34 points, 8 boards on 46% shooting, his teammate Russell Westbrook would have 45 points, and OKC would come back from a 25-point deficit, sending the series back to Utah for a critical Game 6. Now in this Game 6, Paul George would have the worst playoff game of his career, scoring a measly 5 points on 2 for 16 shooting, 0 for 6 from 3, and 1 for 2 from the line. In this game, he had 6 turnovers and a plus-minus of -2. And the guy who locked down Paul George in this game and outplayed him was Jolly Joe Ingles. In the fourth quarter of this game, PG, with the season on the line, would have 0 points on 0 for 5 shooting and 0 for 5 from 3. So when it mattered most, Playoff P did not show up, and the nickname already had a pretty bad stain on it. Now after that very disappointing exit in 2018, let's look at the 2019 season. And this year, Paul George finished 3rd in MVP voting, 3rd in Defensive Player of the Year voting, was 1st team All-NBA and 1st team All-Defense, and averaged a career-high 28 points per game, while leading the NBA in steals at 2.2. And OKC had a 49-33 record, which is good enough for 6th in the Western Conference. In the first round, they played the 3rd seed Portland Trailblazers, led by Dame Lillard and CJ McCollum. In this series, Paul George, he was actually pretty great, averaging 29 a game, 9 boards, 4 assists, on 44, 32, and 82 splits. And the only bad moment from this series for PG was that the game winner got hit in his face as the clock expired. After the game, he has the infamous quote of saying, "That's a bad shot," which is not a good look after you get a game winner hit in your face. So even with Paul George playing great in this series, after that big time moment from Dame, he kind of got turned into a meme, and the Playoff P nickname was turned into a negative against Paul George. Fortunately, that game in Portland was Paul George's last game ever in an OKC uniform, as after that year, he was traded to the LA Clippers for a host of draft picks as well as SGA, setting up a new Playoff P in Los Angeles in his hometown. And Paul George's first year in LA was pretty rough in 2020. He only played 48 games, the lowest since 2014, while only playing 29 minutes per game in those games. But despite that, the Clippers were the championship favorites with the duo of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. And in the first round, they played the Dallas Mavericks with young phenom Luka Doncic. And Paul George in this series would have one of the worst series of his career. In Game 2, he had 14 points on 4 for 17 shooting, Game 3, 11 points, Game 4, 9, and Game 6, 15. In all those games, he was terrible when it came to shooting the basketball, and his confidence was at an all-time low. And one thing for PG that's really strange is that he can be great one game, and the next game, he can be the worst starter on the floor. In that Dallas series, he still had big-time games where he had 35 points as well as 27, but he also had games where he scored 9 points and 11 points. And that is the big-time problem with Playoff P at this point. He was super inconsistent and rarely, if ever, came through in the big-time moments. Now, despite Paul George's terrible play, the Clippers would still win this series and advance to the second round versus the Denver Nuggets. Now, looking at this Denver series, LA would go up 3-1. In games 4 through 7, Paul George would average 19.8 points per game, 4.8 boards, 3.5 assists on 38, 33, and 94 splits. And in Game 7, Paul George had 10 points on 4 for 16 shooting, including 2 for 11 from 3, with a game score of negative 1.5 and a plus minus of negative 20. So an awful series for playoff P, and to add insult to injury, he had that iconic off the backboard shot late in that game. And if you want to know why playoff P had criticized so much, it's because in those fourth quarters in the playoffs, he was absolutely awful, averaging 4.9 points per game on 29% shooting, 22% from 3, and 84% from the line, with a plus minus of negative 3. And if he even played up to average Paul George standards, the Clippers most likely win that series. But playoff P once again came up short, and his team fell because of that. Now finally, we get to the 2021 season, Paul George's revenge. And this year, PG in the regular season averaged 23-5-5 and was third team All-NBA. But even with that great play, the question still was, would he show up in the playoffs? In the first round versus Dallas, he played tremendously well, averaging 24-9-6 on 46-30 and 89 splits. And in Game 7, even though he shot 5-15, he still played tremendously well on the offensive end, as well as the defensive end, having 22 points, 10 assists, and 6 boards. And if you watch this game, his defensive impact was immense in the third quarter, as well as the fourth quarter. So a big-time game for PG and the Clippers team, overcoming an 0-2 deficit. Now looking at the second round, the Clippers team will play the Utah Jazz. And the first two games of the series, once again, the Clippers will lose both those games. And in Game 3 in LA, the Clippers won by 26 points. Now this brings us to Game 4. Once again, Paul George, he would play great, having 31 points, 9 boards, and 4 assists on 45% shooting. But the devastating part of this game is that Kawhi Leonard went out with a severe knee injury that would keep him out the rest of the playoffs. And finally, Paul George had an opportunity to step up as the number one option and take over for LA. And in Games 5 and 6, he did just that, averaging 33 points per game, 13 boards, 6 assists, 2 steals, 1.5 blocks on 48, 36, and 89 splits. And I have no real proof to back this up, but I think Paul George specifically thrives when he's not under a lot of pressure. In those two games versus Utah, nobody expected LA to win those games. And coincidentally, Paul George played great in Games 5 as well as Game 6. Now, looking to the Western Conference Finals, the Clippers play the Phoenix Suns. And once again, PG in this series was great, averaging 29 points per game, 11 boards, 5 assists on 42, 29, and 77 splits. In this series, he had 41 points in Game 5 on 75% shooting. One of the best games of his career, if not the best game, in a critical must-win Game 5. Now, unfortunately for the Clippers in Game 6, they would lose, and their season would end. But PG had an epic playoff run, carrying this Clippers team for nearly half the postseason. And when Kawhi didn't play for this Clippers team, Paul George averaged 30 points per game, 11 boards, 5 assists, on 44, 30, and 80 splits. That right there is superstar play, carrying this Clippers team to the Western Conference Finals. And I think because of that play, Paul George earned a lot of respect from NBA fans, as well as a few NBA players. He always had superstar talent and top 10 player ability, but the question was, could he show up in the playoffs in a big-time way? In this postseason, he definitely did that, and he earned the nickname of Playoff P. And if you look at some of the stats this year, Paul George, in every single game, he scored 20 points. Joining KD and Michael Jordan as the only players to do so in a 19-game sample size. And once again, the big critique of Playoff P is that he wasn't consistent. And this year's playoffs, he was more than consistent, and he stepped up big time when the Clippers had their superstar go out. And also one thing I want to note is that Paul George in this playoff run played 40.9 minutes per game. That's a total of 776, the most in the playoffs up to this point. He had 511 points, that's also the most in the playoffs. He had 183 boards, that's the third most, and once again had 20 points in every single game. And even if they didn't win the championship or make the finals, in this playoff run, Paul George proved a lot of people wrong and finally lived up to the Playoff P nickname. So that right there is the brief history of Playoff P, and how he finally earned that nickname while playing great in the 2021 playoffs. So that is the end of the video. Let me know your guys' thoughts. How great do you think Paul George was in the playoffs? Has he finally earned the Playoff P nickname? And has he finally proved he's an elite top 15, top 20 player in the NBA? So let me know your guys' thoughts, and as always, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys next time.